Welcome, everybody, both here in our auditorium and on our live web broadcast at 911memorial.org/live. I'm Clifford Channon. I'm Senior Vice President of the museum. It's a pleasure to be here tonight in this wonderful event in partnership with 92nd Street Y, Mike.com, and PRI. I want to make a special welcome, first of all, for those of you who have not been here before. You are here, as you probably know, at the 9/11 Museum, which opened in May 2014 and has since received nearly 7.5 million visitors. And this is something that has become a place of pilgrimage, not just for New Yorkers, not just for Americans, but for people from around the world. And part of our mission, of course, is to tell the story of what happened on that day, to tell the story of those who were killed and also those who came to help, but also to carry the story forward these 15 years and more, and to try to find the ways in which 9/11 connects to the world at large. And I can tell you from having been here for quite a while, it connects in every way you can imagine, including the way that we're going to hear tonight. I want to welcome particularly our museum members and encourage those of you who are not museum members to consider becoming such. Our PRI Ambassador Council, representatives from the 92nd Street Y, and students from the John Jay College of Criminal Justice, from the CSNYC Education Meetup Group, from Democracy Prep Charter High School. There you go. And I warned them that I'm looking to them for questions at the end of the evening. Democracy Prep Endurance High School and the Bronx Prep Charter High School. Tonight's program is presented as a part of the Unconvention from PRI, the 92nd Street Y, and Mike.com. The Unconvention is a multifaceted initiative exploring the issues that matter most to millennials ahead of the 2016 election, both online and at live events occurring across New York City. I'm not breaking any news to anybody here. You do know there's an election coming up, yes? People seem to have noticed that. For more information on that, to reserve tickets for events like this one, visit 92y.org/unconvention. And we also encourage you to join the conversation on social media using the hashtag #TheUnconvention. And if you haven't yet participated in the Unconvention World Vote, visit pri.org/worldvote to state your choice for president and explain why you've made that choice. Now, we are gathered here tonight to talk about data. More data is being produced today than at any other point in human history. But the question is, what's the purpose of all this information? How's it changing the world and how we live? And what use can it be put to make the world a better place? We're going to feature a conversation tonight between the two gentlemen on stage here. First, I'll introduce nearest to me Todd Zwillich, who's been reporting from Washington, D.C. for close to 15 years, initially covering science and medicine, then joining Reuters. He became a public radio reporter in 2006, covered nominating conventions, Republican and Democratic, in 2008 and onward, joining WAMU in Washington and several other public radio stations. Todd first appeared on PRI's The Takeaway program in its pilot phase, and he joined the show as Washington correspondent in 2009. DJ Patil has been the Deputy Chief Technology Officer for Data Policy and the Chief Data Scientist at the White House Office of Science and Technology since he was appointed by the President in February 2015. The mission of the U.S. Chief Data Scientist, I'm sure you all know this, but I'll read it anyway, is to, quote, responsibly source, process, and leverage data in a timely fashion to enable transparency, provide security, and foster innovation for the benefit of the American public. And reading that, I have to say, DJ, it's quite something that you actually got some time off to come here tonight. His primary efforts include incorporating data science into government and agency missions, collaborating on the Precision Medicine Initiative, and supporting the Data-Driven Justice and Police Data Initiatives. Prior to his current position, DJ worked as a data scientist for LinkedIn, Skype, PayPal, eBay, Greylock, and Relate IQ. Before his career in the private sector, he also worked at DoD, where he used social network analysis to anticipate emerging threats to the United States. There he served as the co-director of the Iraqi Virtual Science Library, which was used to help Iraqi engineers and scientists rebuild their country's infrastructure. Our program format tonight is quite simple. My introduction is about to end. Todd and DJ will be in discussion for about 40 minutes, 45 minutes or so. I'll come back up. We'll take some questions from the audience, make some closing remarks, and thank you very much for coming. But first, I'll turn it over to Todd Zwillich and DJ Patil.
Thank you all for being here, and what an honor to be in this museum. DJ and I just had a brief whirlwind tour of the 9/11 Museum. It was too fast, but a real pleasure, and thanks to the Memorial for giving us that tour. It was moving, and I think we both wanted to spend the 2.5 hours that it usually takes to go through. It was an honor and a pleasure to be part of that. So I was getting ready for you all over the last couple of days, and I was doing a little bit of research myself on the frontiers of big data and analytics. And right away I was swept up. One moment I was reading about how data is being used to make sure that AIDS drugs were getting to the people who need them the most. Then about how data trails allow our intelligence officers not only to track terrorists, but also to help predict who are the people that those terrorists might try to recruit to be tomorrow's terrorists. One minute I was reading about how political campaigns maximize their dollar by using data to target the exact block where people are most likely to vote, while ignoring the other block 2 blocks away where they probably won't vote, thus maximizing their donor dollar for the campaign. Early this morning, Elon Musk tweeted at about 4:50 this morning a video of a Tesla automobile leaving the driveway of a residence and driving through city streets, stopping at stoplights, making right turns, left turns, braking for pedestrians, arriving at work where a human who had not touched the wheel got out of the car and went into the office, and then the Tesla looks for parking spaces, doesn't find one, goes to the next parking lot and parks, all without the touch of human hands, and the implicit use of big data there can't be denied. I even found a company right here in New York willing for a fee, which I'm sure isn't small, to use big data analytics, housing density, income levels, crime stats, labor stats, to help me choose the very best corner for my brand new restaurant. I don't have a brand new restaurant, but if I did, I could spend, I don't know if it's 20 grand, but I could certainly spend that money to use big data to make sure that I maximized my profits in the restaurant business. But the most useful thing I found by far in my research is a 5-step guide on how to use big data to understand how viruses travel and transmission patterns. This guide helped me predict the spread of disease, how to narrow the search for a cure, maybe use analytics to target specific areas on a virus when I look for the cure that might help develop a new drug to save me and other people. This guide told me how I could use data to know where to run to escape the approaching epidemic, and where I was most likely to find people to help me, and most importantly, how to predict the behavior of my enemies in this world so that I can discover and exploit their weaknesses. Now, all of this critical emergency response knowledge fueled by big data was to the end of surviving the coming zombie apocalypse. Now, that made me laugh too. I also laughed at that, but it revealed something else, that a lot of people believe that after the chuckles about big data, after the sci-fi fun is over of The Matrix and iRobot, that we're not taking the perils of big data seriously enough, and that the future of data and the future of artificial intelligence is something that we have lulled ourselves into a sense of wonder but complacency about. And DJ has been working on all these problems and more. And that's why I'm glad that he's with us. Give him a very brief round of applause. We'll get right into it. So after that introduction, I'll start with The Matrix, and then we're going to knock down some of The Matrix. But not the sci-fi part of it necessarily, but the role that these things play in our culture when we look at big data and analytics. But there's a scene in there, almost everyone has seen it. If you haven't, you'll have to catch up with us in a couple minutes. But there's a famous scene where Keanu Reeves walks up behind one of the characters and he's just looking at torrents of numbers coming down the screen, and Keanu's new to this post-simulation world. He doesn't know what's going on, and the guy says, well, when you understand the illusion, I just see pinup girls. He's just looking at pinup girls. Are you the guy who looks at these torrents of data in the world and sees a tapestry that the rest of us don't see?
No.
Good, because that guy dies.
Exactly. He didn't do so hot in the movie. He wasn't in the sequel, definitely. There's two very unique ways that we're seeing data being utilized in this case. There's one case where people are really looking at it to see what is a tapestry of the world, of society, of inside our bodies at the genomic layer. What does that look like? How do we think about it? How do we think about space, data coming off cosmic rays? We just saw the first time what does a collision of two black holes actually sound like, the chirp. And this was the measuring of the first time of measuring a gravitational wave. All these are data that is a tapestry. The type of data that I have gotten most interested in is the one that starts fundamentally with a problem that a human can articulate. And those are the nature of things like, what does it mean to find a cure for some of our most pressing problems? That can be cancer. That can be cardiovascular disease. That can be schizophrenia. It also looks like our criminal justice system. And how do we do that? The world I like to believe, and the place where data is most powerful, is when it has a name. And those data points have names. And when you can talk to them and you can see them, and then you try to say, well, how are we going to find a solution? Data becomes a tactic in the ability to find solutions and to find scalable processes that are going to enable that to come together. And we've done this for decades. We just haven't had the ability to, this new type of machinery of artificial intelligence, machine learning, some of the other types of statistical techniques. These things, this math, this science that's evolved, that allows to make other things that have been bespoke scalable in an extraordinary way. And we can talk about some of the very precise ones about how that actually comes together.
I do want to do that with the issue of national security and terrorism. You have a background in that. It seems like you've had such a long career already. And it doesn't
Data makes you scalable.
It does. So terrorism is one area that in the execution of it is this unique interaction of human behavior, human psychology, and human actions before you even get to the right of boom, right? So pick a window into how people like you who were working on not only stopping bad guys, but understanding how they behave and how they approach others to recruit, how that works when you're crunching their behavior either online or in real life into things that you can use.
I mean, this is actually one of the most interesting things being here. One of the things that we often think about being here at the 9/11 Memorial, we hear the words big data and these things, and we think some Silicon Valley style company came up with these ideas. These solutions, these techniques, these ideas, they stemmed because after 9/11, we were looking for saying, hey, how could this happen? How did we not see this signal in the noise? And are there other signals in the noise that we're not seeing? And what does that look like as we move forward in society? This was a time when social networking, there wasn't a social network yet. There was no Facebook, MySpace. These things were just very ephemeral ideas. This was still the idea of just chat rooms and AOL Instant Messenger in that era. So the liquidity of information was still just very much email or very lightweight based. There was no smartphones. There was none of that. So the approach that we took, and many of the things that when a number of us who were traditional scientists out of mathematics or meteorology, take any of the big sciences, astronomy, oceanography, we came and started looking at these problems. We first said, well, where's the data? Like, what data do we actually have? And it turns out there wasn't as much data as we like. So one of the things we really started focusing on is what do simulations look like to help us think through a broader range of problems? Because at that time, the notion that somebody would actually fly a plane into a building was an astonishingly far off concept. And so what were the other foreign kind of concepts that could happen? And could mathematical simulations give us a different ability to think about things? There was simultaneously also the question of these networks, these terrorist cells, these networks, and how robust are they? Are they structural? Is there a way that we can identify their structure? And if you're able to remove part of that, does it collapse or does it stay robust? That basics of thinking are very mathematical problems in the world of social network analysis. And some of this basis is some of the things that we already know. This idea of, I'm connecting to, we're connected by 2 degrees of separation, 3 degrees of separation. We're all connected in the world by just a few degrees of separation. Well, how do you mathematically, we can say that's a statistic. What do you do with that statistic? How do you apply it? How do you leverage it to actually get a better understanding of the world or situational awareness?
So that's interesting. So give me a concrete example then of a time when you were in the Pentagon or somewhere else where seeing this information and processing it for the first time, you learned a new question to ask that you didn't know before that had to be asked. Part of this is learning. This data is useless until you learn the new questions that you can ask using it. Right? So give me an example.
So in fact, many of those examples are the ones that weren't necessarily published or done inside the Pentagon. They're the ones that were actually actively worked on by academia. Because this type of math in the exploration process isn't one of just operational capacity. There's an operational capacity component of it. But the more interesting thing is just to ask some fundamental questions of, do we actually understand a different culture or different way groups are operating or the way that they're interacting? That science and what we were doing back then, 15 years ago, was really the basis of just the mathematics to start thinking about those things. Those technologies have gone a long way, and we often think of this as just a national security thing, and this big data just collecting large amounts of data. These are in many ways the same algorithms that help you identify where is a cancer site on the genome. It's a signal and noise problem. There's this huge, massive genome. It's crazy long. It's got all this information. And then you've got to layer on top of all that information what we call the phenotypical data, which is your environment, which is you can think of your wearable that's measuring how you sleep, what your air quality is. All these things, as you start to layer it on, become increasing noise. Which portions of it matter? Those same ideas of, if you will, crawling through the data, sorting through it, finding an interesting signal, that's the idea. That's the framing that we really leverage. And one of the things that was the most powerful for me in coming back into federal service this time was the very concrete aspect of the president really saying, well, our most pressing problems, we often take our data and we always apply it to national security. What happens if we take that same leverage of technology and apply it to our most pressing domestic problems? Healthcare, education, climate, all these other things. What would we see if we brought that same force multiplier of technology to those things? And that's what we're really seeing is the concrete tangibles. And so when we say, what are those concrete things that are actually being delivered, we can actually point to those in a more interesting way, in my opinion, a substantially more interesting way than we can in national security. And criminal justice is one of the best concrete examples where we're seeing not only dramatic cost improvements, but direct quality of lifestyle improvements for a city.
So you just got to cities, and I want to get right there. That's exactly where I wanted to go next. There are imperatives at work in the national security realm, in the military and intelligence realm, where I think a lot of Americans feel like they're willing to let scientists and military officers and intelligence officers operate in their world and get the job done. But here at home, when data is applied to so many of these areas, whether it's medicine, criminal justice, transportation is a huge one in cities. Analytics are breaking down enormous barriers in cities, analyzing traffic patterns, how many cars come in, analyzing public transportation usage. There are companies now, their sole business is to, city, you give us a contract, we will gather this data for you, and we can increase the efficiency of your traffic arterials by 40%. We can get rid of all these useless bus lines that you have to run because you have to serve these neighborhoods, but they only run at 8% capacity. We can use data to help solve that problem. And that's all upside. And in policing too, there are firms that help with this, and it's all upside. Then the question becomes, who owns the data once it's collected, especially when these firms, and you've worked for many of them, are doing business with the public and with the taxpayer, because it's not just the contract where I get 10 million to do this for the city of New York. The money is, I want to own all that data. When New Yorkers are getting on the train every day and going to work and going back, I want to own that data for the future. They're getting it through the taxpayer. So this is a major point of contention that hasn't been settled yet, and I'd like to hear you talk about that a little bit.
Right. So there's actually two parts here that I think are super important. There is who owns the data, and that is just the question of the raw data. There's another question of how is the data being utilized, and what are the algorithms that are sitting on top of that. Let's take the data portion first, because the algorithm one is equally important, because there's a result that is happening because of your data, and you may not have transparency into how the decision is created on that, and that may have a big implication. Do you get services, or are you denied services based on an algorithm? And the intersection of algorithms and civil rights is going to be a massive challenge for the decades to come. On the data portion, the place where I think we're seeing the biggest movement, process, and challenge all simultaneously is in healthcare. Health records. 10 years ago, 97% of hospital records were on paper and triplicate all over the place. Through the HITECH Act, they are now more than 90% on electronic medical records. So that's great, except when you go talk to the physician, is the physician talking to you, or are they typing? It's not really a very satisfying thing when they're sitting there typing instead of actually interacting. The human-computer interaction of the data entry is not great. Secondarily is who owns that data? Our belief is, and I think most of the population's belief is that it's the individual patient's data. It's your data. And why shouldn't you have access to that data at a push of a button? If you need it to go from one physician to another physician, shouldn't that just be a push of a button these days? Why should that be hard? That notion of data interoperability, the idea that data should work for you rather than against you, that's what has to happen. And there's been incredible progress. There needs to be substantially more progress so that the data works on your behalf. You should never have to say, oh, I need access to my data. Your data should just appear wherever your physician needs it to, or your nurse practitioner, or whoever the healthcare professional is, the care team. They should have access to it.
In a sense, though, that's an easier question to answer for the individual in their doctor's office, because we all have this intimate sense of privacy in healthcare.
That's right.
In the broader example, like in a city where millions of people are coming and going, this issue over where the line of ownership is very fluid, and is a point of contention now between the big private companies that are offering to provide these services and people who have their jobs in service of the public.
That's right. And one of the big things, so there's in there, our mission is to responsibly unleash the power of data to benefit all Americans. That notion of responsibility and the way you use that data is part of the social contract. And what I would like to see is when companies and other people are using federal and local data, which we want that innovation to happen. We want people to find new things. But we also want that social contract such that that data is also being returned back to the city so it is utilized and leveraged. And that the business model isn't, hey, well, let me try to hold the data tighter and hold you hostage because I have the data. That is not only a bad business practice, that is being a bad citizen. That is not an acceptable way of being data responsible or data driven. In fact, what you do best when you have this is data is a conversation. A concrete example of this is we have a project called the Opportunity Project, and this is done jointly with Housing and Urban Development and Census. And one of the things that we realize is there's a number of these companies that you see that, take your favorite real estate listing and other type things, and they have that data. When they build the product, who are they building the product for? They're oftentimes building the product for what I call the photo frame experiment. And you remember, you ever look at like a photo frames and you look at the people and you're like, who are these people? They're always like happy, they're like glowing. You're like, it's like they don't build for the rest of society. They don't build for the 100% of society because they think, oh, these are edge cases. Well, those edge cases are a big portion of the population. A victim of domestic violence, a veteran, or somebody who's coming off of active service, now a veteran coming to reintegrate in society, somebody who has physical disabilities or emotional or mental disabilities. When they pull up one of these apps, they don't see the check boxes that would help them know what resources to get. How close am I to a public recreation center or those things? It's too hard. So what we've done is working in conjunction with them, Zillow, Redfin, all these companies, they've said, oh, that's what it means to incorporate the federal data, the local data, and build the product in a way that benefits all the people, but also take that data and return it back, which is an example of what Fitbit is doing through the Opportunity Project, which is saying, hey, city, let's package up this data in a way that is useful so we don't have to do it on a one-off basis, but if you're a city, you can come in and download this data and see where people are walking, so that you can think about where to invest. Now, the thing that I think we have to caution is not everybody in our population can own a Fitbit or one of these wearables. And so we have to make sure that we are thinking about all of that society. And we can't just be biased because we have data in all those places. But that brokering and where we show that, hey, it's safe to share that data, and in fact, that's a better business practice because it helps everyone think about it better. That's what we're starting to see is a better social contract between companies. And the good ones, the ones that get this, my belief is that they are going to have a much longer longevity of a business cycle, and they are going to, because they're working collectively, they are going to be much better at seeing the shift of company dynamics to get ready for whatever is coming next.
Now, there are a lot of people who are, as I sort of said in my introduction, are sounding alarms about this kind of data and where it might be going. But let's stop before we get there and talk about you for just a second.
Oh, can we go back to algorithms though? Because we have to talk about algorithms. Because this is, I'm sorry to derail you here, but I just want to emphasize the importance of because we talked about the data, but we need to talk about the algorithms. So the algorithms right now, there's algorithms that are making decisions on our behalf all the time. You go in to apply for a credit card. That's an algorithm that's saying yes or no. There's an algorithm that says, are you declined coverage or something else? There's all these things. And some of the places where we don't see algorithms are hidden behind layers that we don't have transparency behind. There is an incredible opportunity for data to empower people. There are a lot of people in this country who do not have a credit record or a sufficient credit record where data exists to say yes or no on credit score. But there's plenty of data. We just don't look at that data. So big data technologies could empower a large portion of the population to have access to credit, which would be good. But there's also, what about the techniques that are there? Is it bias? What about the bias? And we saw a very recent example where there is a judiciary that has a tool and it says, what type of bail should you be given? And that bail, it's a calculator, it's a risk assessment, says, are you at high risk? The problem is that calculator is highly biased, yet somebody slapped a label on it that says, data science, so therefore it must be right.
Dispassionate.
Yeah, but it doesn't take into account. In fact, a bunch of journalists did a really great assessment of showing how biased it was. Here's the challenge. Without that risk calculator, the human is substantially more biased. But this is still biased. That's not acceptable because in a mathematical world, where we're constantly working on this together, we would say, hey, there's flaws here, let's test it, let's make it transparent, let's allow people to evaluate it. And so we need to do that evaluation process and to provide transparency, because as that digital world becomes more and more prevalent, we can't just assume that the number or the score or whatever decision that's coming out of something is unbiased. We have to assume with a degree of skepticism that we have to think about what that implications are of those results. And that is equally important with where the data is being surfaced, garbage in, garbage out, and are we making sure that the data is serving all of the population, not just a small percentage of the population?
And one of the most fascinating things about this is from the perspective of a public servant like yourself and somebody working in the public sector. One of the concerns is how the amount of time and effort that you in the public policy realm are spending thinking about this, questions of how much, if at all, this is permeating the private companies who have a different set of incentives. And we'll get to that in a little bit. Are you willing to talk about yourself just a little bit? Because I want to, just for a second.
I am, and I'm happy to talk about how we're actually making sure this is sticking at the company level.
And you have some experience in those companies. You came to all this, though. You'd be forgiven for thinking that DJ sort of went into national security or became a data scientist from some postgraduate lab at MIT that you were living in, but that's not where you came from.
No, that would have been nice.
Yeah. Well, tell us where it was.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, the kind of the brief version is, I think, so the place that I am most grateful to, I am grateful for a few people. The first thing that I'm grateful for is getting suspended in high school and then getting arrested and then getting kicked out of my math class, all within 1 quarter. It was, it's a triple.
You failed quickly.
I failed quickly, but I got my butt kicked, and the person who suspended me is, and I was able to give a commencement speech about him, is this guy, Mr. Knapp. And Mr. Knapp really also put me in a number of leadership programs. And he gave me the opportunity to really course correct. I course corrected pretty much everything except for math. And so as a result, I couldn't really get into college. And so I went to the local junior college, De Anza Junior College in California, and I was very fortunate as California had done an amazing job investing in their community colleges. And I was one of those kids who was just not ready to go to college. And I just didn't know, I also didn't understand the basics of math. So I did what every smart young student does, is you just enroll wherever your girlfriend, boyfriend classes are. And so my girlfriend was taking this class called calculus. Seemed like a good idea at the time, until I walked in and I was like, holy crap, I don't understand any of these things. And the book is thick. And so it was a sort of very stunning moment of that I think is really important, is when you face a fork in the road and you get to decide that, do you want the easy path or do you want to take the steep uphill path? And the president has on his desk what I think is one of the most important valuable lessons on this is hard things are hard. And what I did was, I was grateful for this, is I went to our local public library, which was also excellent, and I just checked out all the math books and decided to see if I could teach myself math to be in this calculus class and keep up and stay with my girlfriend. Maybe been also some portion of this. And I taught myself pretty fast. And I was like, there's nothing worse than going through 4 years of high school and then teaching yourself math in a couple weekends and going, oh, that's all it took? It's like, wow, that wasn't so bad. But what it more so did is that junior college lecturer, that professor, she's able to teach me math and explain it about core principles. And I fell in love with those core principles. And the thing I remember this very clearly. One afternoon, my girlfriend said, gee, it seems like you're spending an incredible amount of time on this math homework. And I said, it's not like I'm going to become a math major or anything. And sure enough, a year and a half later, I was a math major. And then from there, I just took every class I could. And I went to UCSD. started spending a lot of time in the oceanography groups, working on chaos theory, just falling in love with it, and just playing with data. I was looking at, data from sardine populations. For those that don't know, there's a big collapse of the sardine populations off the coast of California, and I was really interested in why is this, and playing with that data. When I got to Maryland, this was a time where we finally had, computer labs where you could really run stuff, and the lab, I finally got permission to use the lab, and the lab had there was a small little, what I think today we would call a security vulnerability. It allowed you to take over all the computers in the department. I may or may not have used that to my benefit. But what I did is I basically went in every night and I would download data from the National Weather Service. And I would process that data every night and all the night long. And then I would finish up and get off everyone else's machine so no one would know by the morning. And through that process, I'd find patterns. I was just looking for patterns. And I'd make these color plots, and this is like inkjet printer time. And I'd go around to the meteorology department and be like, does my pattern mean anything? And they'd be like, most of the time they were no. Until one time they were like, that's weird. And that actually led us down a path of finding a new way to think about forecasting the weather. And so that whole story, that sort of long version of that, is that how unique is it that we live in a country and a society where a kid who has really got their start in community college goes and downloads a whole bunch of data that is accessible on the weather into a lab and is able to come up with an insight that is now deployed in all the national weather systems and all these kind of things, just because they have ability to have access to a computer and some time. That's the power of open data. That's that power. And I'm not the only person. I have met kids. There's a 17-year-old kid, Nathan Hahn. Now he's like 18. Nathan, I mean, he's just, he's clearly on a trajectory.
Yeah.
At 17, though, he was interested in machine learning and AI. And so he was like, hey, I need a data set. And he was interested and found this data set called dbGaP, which is the genome data set. And he's like, I'm interested in data for cancer. He starts playing with it and starts writing his own AI algorithms. His AI algorithms are on par with the best researchers in the world, just because he has access to this data and he's playing with it. That's the power of innovation when we say unleash the power of data. The greatest insights don't come from somebody who's sitting in a lab just toiling. Nowadays, that answer to some of our most pressing problems is going to be solved by some kid that is playing in his living room with a machine, with a computer. It's going to be solved by potentially some kid on a reservation in tribal lands with access to a high-speed connectivity to go plug into Google, Amazon, Microsoft, pick your favorite cloud super solution and have more computing available to them than all the computers that we had up through the 70s at the push of a button. That is the utopia aspect of what data is going to provide, while we simultaneously have to make sure that we're doing that in the responsible way to ensure that nobody's doing something that is irresponsible with that.
Right, and let's talk about Utopia for a second. Now, one of the things I just learned from your autobiography, DJ, there is that at the beginning, you weren't quite honest with us. You said that you were not that guy in the Matrix who can see the numbers floating down. But you were in that college meteorology lab, and you kind of were that guy.
It's true. So because what I didn't know at that time, and I'm glad you called me out on this, because what I didn't know at that time, like many scientists, I didn't know how to talk to people. I didn't know how to really get to the problem that is a real human problem. And one of the things that I was really fortunate enough to be around is people who actually knew the human side much more than the math side. In the part of that national security, we often think of, well, let's just understand a culture or a society by looking at some data. That's one of the worst things you can do. What you have to do is you have to talk to people who actually live in that culture. You have to talk to people who actually have spent time studying it. We have terms for those people, anthropologists, sociologists. We can't forget that we have an extraordinary, powerful set of experience and wisdom that is distilled into the liberal arts. And those liberal arts are equally valuable. And if we dismiss them and just say that we're running to a world of data, we are doing ourselves a great disservice. But more importantly, the people that are impacted by these algorithms, we are doing wrong by them.
So that gets me exactly to where I wanted to get, which is what you mentioned, which is Utopia. And when we started talking, I sort of invoked some movies that we all love, like The Matrix and iRobot. And I brought them up for a reason, not just because we've all seen them. Hopefully, they're awesome. You should see them. But in that awesomeness, we all think that they're awesome. But these films depict a world that is horrific. And I bring them up because there are people who are worried that our sense of the technological future and AI, that we are selling ourselves out and that we're fooling ourselves about what it really is. The writer and I'll call him a philosopher, intellectual Sam Harris, showed a picture of a future of a famine. He showed a child starving and he said, nobody thinks this is awesome. Then showed a picture of a future where hyper-intelligent AI robots rule the world and outsmart us, and everybody thinks that's an awesome movie. He says that we are not going to stop in our quest for building ever more intelligent machines. He says the train has left the station and there is no brake to pull. Yep. And that we have not taken the time now to think through what actually happens when that intelligence inevitably exceeds our own. We have a self-centeredness about our own intelligence, that we are the endpoint of intelligence, he says. But really, it goes human and chicken are sort of here. But once the machines start, once we imbue machines with enough self-learning and intelligence to build other machines that can do this, it's actually way up a parabola that we're not letting ourselves understand. And that there's a gigantic risk here, and that we better think it through. And it's not fun like iRobot. It's not fun like The Matrix.
Right. Wow, that's a downer.
Yeah, I think it was intended to be.
And here's the part that I think is really important. So for those that are interested in learning much more about this, the White House, we just released 2 weeks ago the official White House paper and assessment on artificial intelligence. And there's a couple things that are really important in there. One is we highlight the importance that every data scientist, every person working in this field must have training in ethics as part of the central curriculum. Equally important is that every one of those types of the next generation people must be trained in security. Whether you want to call it cybersecurity, whatever you want to call it, is because how do you make sure these systems are not going to be tampered with or pushed around by nefarious actors is equally an important component of this. The ethics is super important because we have to have these conversations. These are the discussions that must happen today. The world in which, I think if we look at our technology arc, and for those that are, I would encourage people to see, the president had a whole session at the White House Frontiers Conference where we went at length into this. But the summary of it is, if we look across our technical arc of our history, and we've watched how technology has changed, there has always been a portion of the population that has done a job, and we have replaced them with technology. In many cases, we see that, and our mental model is, ooh, what do we do about them? Well, child labor. I think that was a good one that we eliminated. We should replace child labor with machines. That's a smart thing to do. You know, working on the assembly lines in the Model T era, those weren't great jobs. It freed up people to do a lot of better jobs. There's a lot of other jobs also, like the horse carriage rider, those other things that have been freed up to do other things. One of the big first things that we have to think about is what is going to be the economic shift that's going to take place as we have autonomous self-driving vehicles, in particularly the trucking industry and cabs and all of those types, service delivery. Those we have to think about. We can't just say, leave that population behind. Absolutely not. We must be thinking about it, and that's one of the things that we are aggressively pursuing and talking about.
Autonomous farms in Africa could produce a lot more food for Africans, but put tens of millions of people out of work.
It could. it also frees them up to potentially spend time, because they have substantially better quality of higher nutrients, freeing that up to actually work on other problems. So if it is going to create, if that technology revolution is going to focus on that classic Maslow's hierarchy of food, clothing, water, shelter, great. Let's do that. Let's make sure that materials for housing are more readily available, that we're able to make smarter decisions about how to farm, how to get nutrients to where they are, that we have such an incredibly inefficient process of how we move food, and how much of that food is lost due to waste, due to rot and other things. If we can create a smarter way of doing that, we'll be able to feed a remarkable more amount of people. The part that you're also bringing up is about what is often referred to as a sentient being, and creating a new species and all of those things. The place where I think we need to first focus on is, what does augmentation look like for us? What does it truly mean to augment ourselves with technology? I want the AI system that is crawling through all the research papers, all the data, so that when a human hears the word cancer for the first time as a diagnosis, they have already pulled up the 5 possible clinical trials that they might be able to be in. Here are a whole comprehensive assessment of how to think about this. Not just how a patient does in next to, here at a Cedars-Sinai or Mount Sinai, but also to somebody who's in Boise, Idaho, or some other portion of rural America, that they should get the same quality of care, and the data enables that. The physician doesn't have to stay on top of all this new data coming in, but the data is going to augment them to help think about it. That's the portion I want. I want that automation that we all have right now, where when we pull out our phone and we get directions, because when's the last time anybody here bought a physical map? Right? Like, we don't do that anymore. We are already augmented. Here's the problem. We say we're already augmented. This country is not fully augmented that way. There's a large percentage of the population that doesn't have access to a cell phone with connectivity to allow that. And so the fact that we don't produce maps means that portion of the population is left out. We have to be thinking about that holistic set of solutions to not also let people, we have so much work to do to carry along the people who would benefit the most from the augmented solutions. Education is another perfect example. Like, how do we develop customized curricula? All of that is there. And we haven't even talked about criminal justice yet. About how much, because I think we got some John Jay students here, right? So when we talk about criminology and the shift that we're seeing, not only in policing, transparency of policing. Can we go down this path for a second?
We can go for a second. Yeah. And yes, DJ's going to go down this path. Start to think about your questions, because right after he's done talking about criminal justice for a minute, which he very deftly segue to after my dystopian question, which is a serious one, but I appreciate it. Think about your questions and comments, because we're coming to you right after this. This will give you 2 minutes to think about your questions, and then Cliff's going to come up and call on you so that you can be part of this discussion in the Q&A period. So go right ahead.
So there's 2 big components that I just want to share of policing. There's an incredible challenge if people are using, like what we talked about, the bail calculators and those type things, and we have to have transparency there. We equally are having this conversation here in New York, where there was the questions around stop and frisk and low-level use of force. Turns out there's not really good data on low-level use of force. That is, did I push you? Did I use a baton? Did I tase? Like those type things. That's not measured. So how do we know if we're doing a good job? One of the things that we have is we have more than 120 different jurisdictions who signed on to the President's Police Data Initiative to open up their data, to open up this, what otherwise traditionally was seen as sensitive data, so the public can investigate it, have that.
It's enormously important. We had a panel the other night with the Young Convention on Political Correctness. This exact issue came up of people, one of our panelists was an African-American young woman, a journalist who covers this. We raised the issue that African-American researchers are saying, the data isn't there on initiation of use of force. We want to know how big this problem is, not anecdotally, and the problems they're facing in their own community by even raising a scientific question. That's another part of this, but we got to this very point that
the data
aside from the iPhone videos, which are egregious, the data's not there.
That's right, and the Attorney General last Thursday called for a nationwide collection of this. This is built on this idea of the Police Data Initiative to say, hey, Dallas, how are you collecting the data, which has been doing a really good job of this, and saying to somebody else in another portion of the country, saying, hey, you know, how should you do this? How do we make this happen across us? Because it's not a federal, generally a federal, this is a local issue. Another flip one is, and I don't know if people recognize this, because there are 11.4, probably 11.3, 11.4 million Americans that are going through only 3,100 local jails. 3,100 local jails. They will stay there on average 23 days. 95% of them will never move on to prison. These are people who are just cycling through the local jail structure. The cost of all that is sucking dollars away from putting a new park into place, putting a new teacher out there, a new officer, a new health system, another bus. And all that's going to just pay for the cycling. So who are these populations that are going through there? Turns out a lot are mentally ill. The Cook County Jail, the largest jail facility in the United States, single facility in the U.S., 1/3 of the population has mental health issues. So Miami-Dade, Florida, what they did is they took this data from the criminal justice system, moved it over to the health system, and they said, hey, who are these people? And they said, what happens if we train the officers in dispatch to identify these people as mental health issues and get them to mental health institutions instead? When they did that, in 1 year alone, Miami-Dade saved more than $10 million. First year, cost only about $1 million to train. But the real value is they closed a full jail. They closed a jail. So, and this is not, we're not talking like machine learning and AI and sentient beings here. We're like, hey, you got a spreadsheet? Cool. Do you have Jack on your list? No, go fish. You're like, that's our level of math here. And that's $10 million and closing a jail. Imagine if we brought real data science to that problem. What could we do to get people to the care they need and addressing recidivism and all these issues? It has been an untapped area because it is a problem that we wish didn't exist, and we don't want to use the data to accept where we're having challenges in it. And we have to confront that reality.
Now is your time. So you've been primed. It's now Cliff's time to get all these great questions out of you for the next 10 or 15 minutes.
Thank you, gentlemen. We have utopia, dystopia, driverless cars, criminal justice, cancer, big data, and the humanities. Thank you, liberal arts. Gentlemen here, please stand for your question. You, sir. Oh, no, I was pointing to the gentleman behind you.
What is the, in your opinion, what is the impact of Edward Snowden been on the value of or the danger of big data?
So Edward Snowden and the value of big data.
Yeah, so the biggest challenge there is, and the biggest challenge, frankly, is like we haven't had the open conversation and the transparency about what is responsible use of data and what is acceptable. Obviously, the way in which it was disclosed made it extremely that much more challenging to have a thoughtful conversation about it. The part that I think is going to be needed going forward is how do we and where do we have that conversation in a way that respects the nature of the challenges of national security and simultaneously allows us to have the appropriate transparency that's required to do all these things. The president's remarks, I think, have been some of the most clear and articulate on this space of making sure that we really have to make sure that we're always citing on the responsible use of the data by and for the public, and what are the terms and conditions of that. And since that has been there has been all of the sequential advancements that have been put into place to ensure that protection. That would probably be the extent that I can go into here.
Where are the democracy prep kids? There's one. Stand up.
Really,
Sir, did you go to democracy?
We're going to go to the...
Did you go to democracy prep, sir? No, we'll go to the student first.
Yeah.
Is there a possibility for the possible outliers of the things that have not only not happened yet, but the things that have not been thought of? Like, is there
Yeah, thank you for asking this question about diseases, because that was one of the examples you brought up. So one of the big recommendations that has been called for by the science advisors to the presidents, everyone is saying, the speed at which we go from seeing a disease or sensing a disease to actually producing a vaccine is just too long. And we have to be able to make that happen exceptionally fast. Right now, with Zika as a good example, Zika is a good example of what happens when you have good electronic medical records. In Brazil, they were able to use those medical records and really start to see, like, hey, wait, there's this pattern. Why are we seeing microencephalopathy growing at this rate? And they were able to really put that data together and say, oh, there's something more interesting here. One of the big challenges with what's going to happen next is we don't understand fully what does disease vectors look like, the way diseases propagate and move as the climate changes, as people move around. In areas like the Middle East, where we are having a very serious problem with refugees migration and a refugee crisis, what does that look like in terms of disease vectors and resource pools and making sure that people get the care that they need? One of the ones that I'm particularly concerned about is drug-resistant tuberculosis, and how do we actually understand how that's propagating, what's happening, and really get prepared with not only getting samples of that data, identifying it very fast by saying somebody's sick in often these hard to reach areas, but getting a biological sample to sequence or identify, is that a virus, is it a bacteria, is it something that's mutated, and how to actually think of it. That disease surveillance network there's parts of that have been in place largely in Central Asia through the Department of Defense, but we need to extend that much more broadly because it is a species challenge that we have to do. And people are starting to think about it, but the portion that you're bringing up is we are still at a fairly early stage of being able to be a virus hunter, find something, and then do that, sort of sci-fi magical moment of just going to the lab and putting it into the whiz-bang machine and saying, aha, I've got the solution in the 45 minutes because that's the only length of the TV show. We have to get there, and that is a large amount of investment is going into that now. It's a great question.
We'll go to the gentleman from the Democracy Prep Alumni Association. Stand up, sir, yes.
I just would like to hear you say a few words about security and hacking, especially since our election is about to take place. And it is kind of scary to think that people could manipulate another nation's elections to the extent that we're hearing about.
Right. So I see you're wearing a VA jacket.
Yeah.
Are you a veteran?
Yes, I am.
Thank you for your service.
Excellent electronic medical records in the VA, by the way.
It actually
My dad
is.
works there. That's how I know.
So the first part is cybersecurity. Like of a problem of our day, we have to really be focused on this. The basics of hygiene are still too tough. How many people have something what's called two-factor authentication on their system? All right, if you're not raising your hand, you should go home right away and look up what is two-factor authentication. And this is the idea that, if you can't just have a password, but you have to have another device that, if you log into your favorite email service, you need to have the code that comes on your phone. Maybe they send it to you. There's other ways, a token. There's lots of ways, but you have to have that. This basic hygiene is critical because we have developed a system where the entire system is predicated that once you're inside, we trust you. And that is a big challenge. The other portion that is going to happen both great and is a big challenge is AI in cybersecurity. AI offers an incredible ability to identify attackers and to patch or to fix solutions as this attacker is moving and trying to fight against you. That is actually how modern day credit card fraud systems are now being built. And that is the systems like we built at PayPal and eBay. They have to evolve as the attacker changes. And so they have to learn. And they have to do it at an incredibly fast pace. So that is the good portion of AI. The bad portion is the AI is attacking you also. So you have an arms race around that. One of the big challenges also is that many of the technologies underlying these systems are legacy systems. They're old, very old, antiquated systems. And those systems were not thought about in a way of cybersecurity changing dramatically. And so you think about those devices that are in the hospital, some of those push, like they push them around. Those are old computers that are literally 5 to 10 years old. They don't have software updates. And so what is the update strategy that a vendor must have and a person who purchases that computers must think about of phasing out technology? Because in the health system, we have a lot of porous technology, for example, underneath. And so if you're just attacking from underneath, you're always going to get in no matter how good your shield on top is. And so we have to think about the holistic approach. And there's been a number of things that we've released and put out there as to how we're doing it. In the healthcare space, the reason I'm bringing that up is because that's the one that I've been mostly involved in. But taking a slight sidebar of that portion of that is, at the VA, for people that don't know, the VA has something called the Million Veterans Program. This program has over 500,000 people who have committed to continue serving. And they have given their data, their electronic medical data, all their biological data, to come together to bring the most comprehensive data set that has ever been created to identify new disease solutions. And then this year, the first kickoff of using that data to understand prostate cancer, PTSD, schizophrenia, bipolar, and cardiovascular disease have kicked off. And it is data that has never, ever been possible except for the fact that veterans are once again stepping into the front lines to protect the country by providing their data to help all of us.
Who's next? I missed you before, so stand up, please.
So one of the things that I found most frustrating dealing with data is getting data sets that you can actually use. Because you've got legacy systems, that don't necessarily talk to each other, collected over years. You've got, maybe you collected fields A through M, but really in the future you need N through Z. And then you have all these, different systems in different industries, different, even in government, decentralized, where you're state and local member. How do you get, how do you deal with that really basic problem where you get data sets that are actually useful?
Mm-hmm. The data set utility question, and how do we make sure data is actually usable across all these things, and the fragmentation of data is very painful right now. So the first thing that we have is we have an executive order that the president signed, at least at the federal level, that says by default, any data the United States government produces is open and machine readable, and that data is supposed to go on data.gov. And so we are slowly making progress on that. One of the biggest impediments to getting that moving faster is the legacy systems, because it's on systems that are just really old and very expensive, frankly, to get the data pushed out on, and those have to be replaced. The data.gov has close to 200,000 data sets in varying different qualities. Some are phenomenal. There's something that for any of the students that want to work on data, we have, unfortunately, right now, more than 100 people who died today on our roads, on our highways. And that number is increasing. Last year it was 7.2% increase in traffic fatalities. This first half of the year it's an additional 10%. We don't know why. We have some ideas. Distracted driving, better fuel efficiency, economy's better, people are driving more, cheaper gas, exactly. Texting, the Pokemon Go, I know. There's all sorts of stuff. But what do? This is a perfect example. This is a pristine data set that when you combine it with other data sets, and that is going to be for someone out there to play with, you're probably going to come up with the answer faster than we're going to come up with the answer. And that is one of those areas. We're hoping now, and one of the things we're seeing at the local city level is each of the cities are starting to ask, what does their data portal look like to bring that data together? The number one thing that is there is this is where we're seeing the chief data scientist, chief data officer's primary role is to have that conversation to say, how do we improve and iterate that data so the data can actually be utilized? Something can be built on it so it's more effective. Because it may not be stored the right way. It may not show up at the right frequency. It may not have the right fields or precision and all those other things. It might not be clean enough. All of that is the parts that I'm most excited to see radically change over the next several years as more and more people work on it. My favorite place is right now is at the local city level, where people are taking this at a very, very aggressive pace.
Let's see if we have any other student body over there. This gentleman, please stand up. Yep.
So my question is, regarding the past events with police brutality, would you say that in such situations using math, data, and technology would bring about solutions to such conflicts, or perhaps would a common psychological investigation be more appropriate to handle them happen?
So the use of data in relation to police incidents in our cities.
Right. So I think this is where data has some of the most potential. And thank you for asking about this problem. Because data allows us to have a conversation. It allows us to talk about the problem. So one of the first things that I think we have to get the notion of is about body cameras. And what is a body camera? A body camera is just the ability to record information. Well, we're right now very hung up on the notion that only the officer has a body camera. And we don't talk about what does the access to that data look like. What is good practice? And we saw this very recently in a number of cases of, well, if there is footage, what is the procedure? What is the policy to open up that data? Who gets access to it? If all that footage is being collected, where does it go? Who stores it? Who pays for it? We have to think about all those other components in it. We have to believe that we're about to enter a world in which any type of incident is going to be filmed by at least 3 cameras. There will be full 3D construction of the environment. The resolution of that camera will be better than human perception, particularly at night. What do we do in that? And how do we use that data? Because we can use that just for accountability, but we also have to ask, how do we use that data to actually better train, to make better decisions, and so the conversation happens? Because what we're seeing is not a change in behavior. We're seeing just a documentation of things that we know have been happening. And we have to get comfortable with that. And we have to ask, what are we doing with that now? That is why the president established the Task Force on 21st Century Policing and made a whole series of recommendations. A large component of them dealt with data and technology. Now, we also have to ask, how are we making sure that data is working on the behalf of the officer? Because there's officers who are good, and being here in 9/11, a lot of very good officers lost their lives. Lost their lives doing their job of putting their life on the line every day. So there's a perfect example of this. University of Chicago did this analysis with one police department and looked at the features of when an officer is predisposed to using force. Just looking at all their data, using basic machine learning. They found the first set, that signal and noise, same thing that you would do in national security thing. There's like figuring out the signal and noise, finding the patterns. There's sort of the obvious things, have lots of accidents, track record of being a bad apple, easy things. You go down a little bit in the ways and you find 2 very interesting features. Number 1, did that officer respond to domestic violence where a child was present? Number 2, did the officer respond to a suicide call or more than one suicide call? So now put yourself in the image of being an officer. Doesn't matter your race, doesn't matter your gender, you're just an officer. And you go to a suicide call. Suicides are messy, physically messy, emotional messy. They're tough. Now, you're done with that, you've written it up, you know, there's lots of emotions going on, and you say, dispatch, I'm done. And they say, great, go out and get out back on the street and pull somebody over for a busted taillight or something. You go pull that person over and they're a little flippant with you. Who is good enough to context shift from that kind of emotional constraint? Did we use data to think about giving the officer any time to decompress? In this case, the data isn't being used to help the officer either. So we have to think about that. And then finally, the whole concept which we have to talk about, which is implicit bias. And what are we doing to understand when do you need training, how should we think about it, and all those things. And a lot of that we're hoping to start seeing surface through the use of low-level force data, as well as the police data initiative and those components. And I think we're at the very beginning of this type of challenge. But the only way this starts to take place is when we sit down collectively as a society, members of the community, the police chief, the officers, the leadership of the city, And we all sit together and we ask, what kind of conversation do we want to have? And how are we going to make sure that data is a component of that conversation? And we're not making just decisions off the data, but we're also just trying to first understand what the data says so that we can decide what a good decision is going to be down the line, and how do we track it so that we can adjust the decisions if we're not okay with them.
Let me turn it back to Todd and DJ for the last word.
And for those of you who still have questions, there's so, believe me, I just started to scratch the surface as I spent the last week sort of getting into DJ's world a little bit, so I feel your pain. You have questions and you want them answered. For those of you who love the plug section of the program, your time has come. Our Unconvention week tomorrow night continues back at WNYC in the green space. My friend Luke Burbank is the host of a show called Livewire from PRI. He's doing a live taping of his show with the Radio Lab guys, for my colleagues at WNYC. If you live in New York, you're a fan of Radio Lab, I hope. If you're not, you should be. Other guests include Baratunde Thurston, the comedy writer. He's a former staffer at The Onion. Very funny guy and a brilliant thinker. He'll be a guest too. He'll make you laugh. Luke is a hoot. If you don't know Luke Burbank, you want to go to the green space right there on Varick Street, which is our home turf at WNYC tomorrow night. And Luke texted me and asked me to plug his show, and so that I've done it. And if you see Luke at the show, you let him know that Todd Zwillich plugged him, because that's what we do for each other. I want to thank everyone for coming out. I want to repeat what I said at the top, which is that it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be part of this. And before we go, DJ, take off your White House hat for just a second. You can become that kid in community college again if you want to or not. But when you get to play with data yourself and you're not working for the president, you don't have to pitch the most important initiatives of the White House. What do you love? What's your geek pleasure? What little part of data do you just want to get in and tinker with when you have the time? What do you like to do?
Oh, weather data.
That's still your thing?
It's still my
your
thing.
From back then?
We just had the hurricane, and I got a chance to actually dust off my weather skills to actually make a forecast.
Did you hit it?
I was right.
You were?
Still got it. I think the probability was not a hard forecast, but I'll take what I can get.
You like to look at your weather app and sneer at them when they get it wrong?
I actually appreciate. I look at something called the forecast discussion. So it's actually what the conversation actually looks. What the weather forecaster is actually saying to get a sense of.
They don't know who you are, and you have a username, and you get in there.
But I still do forecasting for those that need a forecast for their wedding or their kid's birthday parties. So I still have an active practice, so to speak.
Let's all thank DJ Patil for joining us and for being here.
Thank you very much.
And I'd like to forecast that you will walk out the front door here to get out of the auditorium. Thank you both to Todd and DJ, and thank you very much.
Thank you.